What I'm about to present to you is actually the first security analysis of internet voting systems actually used in US high-stakes elections. And I want to be explicit here. What I mean by high-stakes elections are elections dealing with US federal office. So there are probably internet voting systems that are very often used in things like board voting or local school districts or things like that. I'm not talking about that explicitly. A little bit about myself. I actually got all of the research I'm about to present to you are things that I did during my PhD in EECS at MIT. I then went off to Google, became a senior research scientist there. And now I'm actually an assistant professor. I just joined at Georgia Tech, where I do work on things like this. And I lead a laboratory that focuses on security, privacy, and democracy. So issues related to applied cryptography, system security, and policy law and economics in particular. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about why I ended up in this in the first place. We're going to talk about things we found, some of the challenges that existed in doing this, and then we're going to move out to the big picture. So to begin, what do we actually want from a voting system, and what do you want? How do you secure voting in general? And cryptographers have, by and large, provided these wonderful definitions that we can go off of. Really obvious one is correctness and usability. So when you cast your ballot, you want to make sure that it's actually counted correctly. Count as you cast as intended, and only accessible to eligible voters. Right? This is all relatively straightforward, basically what you'd expect so far. This idea of privacy, right? Of course, that an attacker cannot learn a voter's selections. There's also this idea of receipt freeness, and this is where it gets actually kind of a little less intuitive. And the idea here is that no voter can prove the way that they voted after the fact. And the reason why you want this is so that I can't offer you $20 for your vote. And historically, this has happened quite a bit. This is part of what people call the secret ballot. But an important delta there between what you might expect, right, the privacy guarantee and receipt freeness, is that it's a mandatory factor. It's not just that it's receipt free. It's not just that that an attacker can't figure out how you voted. It's that you can't actually prove otherwise. You can't waive the right to the privacy. There's also this idea of coercion resistance, right? A voter cannot cooperate with an attacker to prove the way they voted. So if you hold a gun to my head as I vote, clearly you can tell me which way to vote. I don't need a receipt. It would be very unfortunate. And then there's this other property called end-to-end verifiability, which is a cryptographic property, one that's generally considered table stakes for internet voting systems, which states that voters have proof that their vote was counted correctly. And you might notice that there's this weird property, this receipt freeness thing, and then there's this end-to-end verifiability objects, and they kind of seem contradictory, right? But it turns out that cryptographers tend to take these challenges that seem sort of impossible to meld and are quite good at actually coming up with solutions for them. So this has actually been a source of study for quite a while. So how is in-person voting secured, right? Now that I've given you all these definitions, does in-person voting, the sort of idealized setting, actually solve a lot of these problems? And it's solved largely via these physical mechanisms. You get privacy because you have these lovely voting booths back there and no one can follow you in. You have receipt freeness because you're forced to surrender your ballot as you are leaving the place, so you don't get your receipt as you leave. There are also guards up front, so coercion resistance happens because they're watching to make sure you're not being followed into the booth by, say, an angry partner or something like this. So how about that receipt freeness and end-to-end verifiability property? Well, by and large, most often, although there are some systems that do this, you don't get end-to-end verifiability in the same way that you might in a cryptographic sense. Instead, you have this large system, right? This sort of socio-technical system. So this is a photo of a facility that I took during a tour in Denver, so of a vote counting facility. And the first thing you'll notice is that everyone in this facility is wearing badges, and they have these jackets on. And the badges are of different colors. You can't see all of them, and it actually represents what party you're a part of. So the red badges are Republican, the white badges are independent, and you can't see it in this photo, but there are people wearing ones with blue badges. And the idea being that you cannot physically, you are not allowed on this floor by the staff unless there are two people of two different parties. So there's always someone watching someone else. So you get this sort of more socio-technical vibe. And if that's not enough, that back there actually opens out into an atrium where literally anyone can look in through a window and see the process as it is unfolding. And if anyone doesn't like what's going on or witnesses something that's incorrect, you go to court. And you do all the time, and you sue, and you ameliorate the process that way. So this is how you get that verifiability process through a sort of adversarial checks and balances. So this is how the real sort of standard in-person voting solves a lot of these problems. Now, there's a lot of critiques of this, right? To sort of the internet voting, electronic voting crowd, right, and a cryptography community crowd. The first is this lower complexity argument. So we have this massive socio-technical system with law, poll workers, volunteers, human processes. And the question is, can you replace that with the beauty and purity of mathematics? Right? Can we somehow get to this universe where we no longer have to worry about these socio-technical systems and paper and all this other craziness and just move to this other universe where we're just trusting the math? And the second critique that very often happens is that you want to increase access to voters, right? And there's fair critiques there. For example, accessibility, right? What if you need to be able to cast your ballot without the ability to leave your house? What if you're an overseas or military voter? Or what if you're going through once-in-a-lifetime global pandemic? It turns out that you actually are going to want to be able to vote in a way that's sort of more sequestered. So these are the general critiques. So what about internet voting? Well, it turns out, again, that cryptographers have been looking at this forever. And if you look at actually some of the oldest works in cryptography that helped found the field, having to do with things like mixnets. So if you're familiar with Tor, these are the papers that sort of inspired Tor. The motivation there, at least to start, was actually internet voting, one of the things that they cite. There's also been a number of full systems designed, including things like Helios or Challenge end-to-end verifiable voting, Civitas, Epoch just a few years ago, and the list goes on and on. So I can't cite all of them here, but my point is that this is an active area of research. People are pushing this. And even more than that, it's actually already happening. As the panel before said, this is actually deployed in a number of states. In fact, in West Virginia, they passed a law in 2020 that said that anyone with a disability could cast a ballot over the internet. And it's interesting in West Virginia in particular because West Virginia has a higher number than average of disabled voters. Roughly 22% of their adults, for example, have serious difficulty walking or climbing stairs, which by the CDC's guidelines would make them count as somebody that could cast their ballot over the internet. So as planned for the 2020 primary, roughly 22% of voters in West Virginia were going to use the system called Votes. And actually in Delaware and New Jersey, they both passed emergency measures to allow 100% of their voters to use this other system by Democracy Live. So literally anyone could have signed up during the primary to cast their ballot over the internet. The problem with this is that computer scientists like myself and the national academies, right, the community basically said that at this time, no ballots should be cast over the internet. So this is sort of interesting, but they didn't really have a concrete sort of description of as to why, just we don't really trust this. And that's fair, but not as interesting. So the questions that I came up with at the time, as I was seeing this happening, were, well, how well do deployed internet voting systems actually achieve the security goals that us cryptographers have come up with? And the second, and this includes, again, correctness, privacy, receipt freeness, and coercion resistance. Of course, end-to-end verifiability. And the second, are there other problems that the crypto community hasn't defined, that we haven't tried to look into, that are also valid, right? For example, what about user privacy or authentication? These are all problems that actually exist in the real world, but aren't things that actually exist in end-to-end verifiability papers. Okay, cool. So bottom line up front, I looked at these two systems. I published papers on them. It ended up taking over my life for a number of months, because at the end of this, I realized it was no longer just an idiot graduate student in a research lab. It's now MIT says, which is problematic in and of itself, but it turned into a giant kerfluffle. And the impact here was that all jurisdictions except Utah County, Utah ended up dropping votes for the primary, and New Jersey and Delaware halted use, and others limited the use of that other system to just ballot delivery. So they would get the ballot over the internet, print it out, and mark it and mail it in. And this was a really good result. So what did I find? To go a little bit further. So the way you do a security analysis, the way that you should do a security analysis is you should assume certain adversaries with certain powers and then try to illustrate what attacks those adversaries can pull off. So in this case, you might consider whether or not on-device malware can detect what the ballot says, stop the ballot, learn what the ballot says, alter the ballot, or learn something interesting about the voter. We considered 4 adversaries: on-device malware, the company servers, a network adversary, so this is someone who just sits on the network and watches, and just third parties that are involved in the system that you might not expect a priori. We also questioned whether or not it was end-to-end verifiable, receipt-free, or coercion-resistant, right? So the normal sort of threat model of an election. So Votes is just a mobile app. Let's start with that. And they use these interesting third parties. One of them is called Zimperium, which is a sort of in-app antivirus. They have an identity provider called Jumio. And because venture capital exists, they also use the blockchain. OK. And if you looked sort of at a general sort of network diagram, this is kind of what that network looks like. So let's assume that an attacker controls the voter's device. So let's go into Zimperium's little malware detection system. What this thing will do is it'll scan your device immediately and then after every app resumes. So let's say you go off and check your email or something like that, and you come back to the app. It then scans your phone for whatever maliciousness happens to be there. Looks for things like known exploits or malware on the device. Any indications of analysis. So for example, if you actually enabled like debugger or something like this, it would detect this and flag it. And it'll snitch on you. So it'll tell both Zimperium and Votes' API servers that you were doing something that they didn't like. So that's all interesting. The one problem with Zimperium is that you can turn it off, right? So if you control the device, you control the Java runtime, and you can stop certain things from executing. So who cares whether or not this thing is running? Well, I just returned, yeah, the device is clean. Don't worry about it, bro. And it's actually really not that much code once you get your device set up properly. And without Zimperium, right, the attacker has complete control over the voter. And in fact, any receipts are meaningless, and all communications are compromised as well. So there's really no guarantees here. And there's actually really not much that can be done to prevent this, as far as we can tell. OK. At this point, you're like, but that requires an attack that happens as the election is ongoing. And you're like, Mike, that's a really, that requires an operator. We're expecting the NSA to be sitting on people's phones while an election's happening. That's really hard. OK, fine. What if we only get access to someone's device after the election happens? And it turns out that there's this encrypted database that exists on device, which contains the user's vote history, everything used that's used to authenticate the voter to the server. And this is done through a key derivation of a PIN that the user provides. This PIN is stored on disk, but it itself is encrypted using the Android key store, which means that the keys are actually stored in a hardware enclave when available. And this requires the voter's fingerprint to decrypt. And there's actually a lot of effort that goes into making this actually quite hard to break at an operating system level. So this is actually kind of OK. So all is great, right? Except the PIN was only 8 digits and numeral only. Meaning, if you do 10 to the 8 combinations, right, you get about 100 million pins, about 0.05 milliseconds per guess, so about roughly an hour and a half, you're able to decrypt this database. And now you have access to the voter's vote history. You have access to anything used to authenticate them to the server, and sadness ensues. And the bottom line here is that anyone with forensic access can control the voter and see how they voted. So in other words, on-device malware can basically do everything, all of the attacks that I was discussing earlier. So that's not great. All right, but let's just say that that's not possible, right? Getting access to a bunch of devices might be hard. Maybe we're all running the most recent version of Android. It's really difficult to break into. Great. Let's assume that we're only looking at Votes as servers. And to explain what I found here, I first have to explain this sort of interesting custom cryptography that they have going on, as you might expect from a system that uses a blockchain and uses some sort of custom protocol. And it looks something like this. First, it would establish a standard HTTPS connection. So this is using TLS, right? Just same thing that you use to connect to websites every day. It would then generate 100 ECDSA key pairs, public-private key pairs. It would then discard all secret keys except for the 57th. It would then send all 100 public keys to Votes' servers. Votes' servers would generate their own 100 key pairs, select the 57th, perform key agreement with that one, generate an ASGCM shared key, encrypt under the ASGCM, under the 57th key, agreement key, the ASGCM key. There would be a key agreement on the other side, and all communication from this point forward is using ASGCM. And this is not necessarily terribly broken, but just incredibly strange, because it's already encrypted, and now you're encrypting on top of the encryption. It's just very interesting. And the 57th key thing, for as far as we could tell, had nothing to do with security and everything to do with obfuscation. Right? So if I was sitting there with Wireshark and I had installed this on my TCP dump or something like that on my phone to get like live network capture, I would be super confused to see any of this. Like, this is super strange. And would require much more effort to see what the actual like communication was. Unfortunately, that was also 100% of the cryptography involved. There's no communication with any blockchain that we see, right? So you might expect a proof that something ended up in a blockchain if you were the device. This never happened. In fact, there's no verification of the server's public key, which would mean that active man-in-the-middle attacks are still possible. There's no non-ephemeral public key actually sent from the device. In fact, nothing's ever even signed from the device. This is all ephemeral, which means that the API server can do literally anything it wants. There's no end-to-end verifiability protocol. There's no resistance as you would normally see it. And we're still not entirely sure where a blockchain is involved. So the company servers can do literally anything they want. OK, that's weird. We also know at this point, as I said before, it's not end-to-end verifiable, it's not receipt-free, and it's not coercion resistant. All right. Let's say that Votes' servers are in Fort Knox, right? It's impossible to get access to. They're the only people on the planet that run Cubes OS or something, and it's impossible to actually get access to raw data. Let's just assume a really just like impossibly like unprivileged adversary. Let's assume your broken Wi-Fi router or Comcast or any ISP just sitting between you. They have no special access, just them. Surely they can't get access to anything, right? OK, so this is actually what Votes' app looks like when you're casting a ballot. On the left is just sort of the ballot layout. On the right is the JSON that's actually used to generate that ballot configuration. And what's interesting here is you see how there's candidates with like different URLs. There's candidates with all these sort of interesting pieces of metadata, including various descriptions. And when a voter submits their ballot, what's interesting is that you might just expect them to say, I voted for option 1 for candidate 2, or something like this, or question 2. That's not what they do. Instead, they send all of the metadata of the voter's actual choice. But only that candidate's metadata, right? And what this means is that the ciphertext size actually will leak the voter's selections, and this is made far worse by the cryptographic addition that they've made. So to illustrate, in regular HTTPS, when you connect to a server, what happens is that your ciphertext is actually the encryption of gzip compressed data. So let's say you're going to a specific version of Reddit, some subreddit or something like this. The data that you're getting back is actually compressed using gzip. So it's at least somewhat obfuscated what page you're looking at. In this case, the length of the ciphertext is actually roughly the length of the gzip data. So it's like compressed length. In Votes' protocol, they went ahead and encrypted before compression can happen. And if you can compress something that's encrypted, you probably have broken the crypto, right? Which means that the length of the ciphertext is roughly equivalent to the length of the data. Meaning, if you were to chart the length of the packets when you're submitting your vote, and you were to chart what it looks like when you submit for a candidate with a short description and a candidate with a long description, you might see something like this. Can you tell which packet is the vote submission? Can you tell which packet was for which candidate? So it's very clear from an ISP, even before the packet has a chance to hit vote to servers, who the person voted for. So this ends up meaning that a network adversary who's entirely unprivileged could stop the ballot and actually learn what the ballot said. So this is not great. So, OK, fine. We don't care about security at all. This is a different setting. You know, we're overseas. You know, we've punted on security entirely. What else can happen? Like, surely we've moved further beyond all of this. Let's talk about how their ID verification process works. This is how, by the way, you get a peer-reviewed paper anonymous submission to happen when you can't take a photo of your face. So ID verification in Votes' world works through a photo of your ID and a photo of your face. And it does some ML to match the selfie and your ID. Right? It then does some OCR to pull off your address and things like this. It's actually quite nice. And it also does something called liveness detection to test whether or not you're doing a photo of a photo, for example. So if you have like your ID and then you take a photo, you know, steal someone's ID and then have a photo of them, you can't make it work either. However, none of this is done on the device. So what's happening here is that a video is actually shoved off to servers at Jumio, and they get both of these images and the device's GPS location. And the only place in-app where this is mentioned is in the bottom right corner of these photos on these interstitial screens, right? So no one knows that this is happening. And I wouldn't be such a stickler for this, but the actual initial use case for this were soldiers in theater. So a third-party company is getting your photo ID, your GPS location, where you're actually from, and where you physically are, you know, when you're at war. And by the way, Jumio isn't entirely a US company. The majority of their devs are actually in India. Anyway, so a third party can actually reject your application for you know, access, right, because they can say no, and they can learn a ton of personally identifiable information about the voter. All right, how about Democracy Live? I'm not going to go too in-depth on them because, bluntly, they're a web app. They run on AWS. On-device malware can basically do all of the same things. Company servers can do all of the same things. A network adversary. We only really got to the stop ballot part because, to be honest with you, we didn't try to do anything more because at a certain point it was like kicking a dead horse. It's also not end-to-end verifiable, receipt-free, or coercion-resistant, very clearly. On the privacy angle, the user actually uploads their secret ballot selections, even if they're in a configuration where the voter wanted to print out and physically mail in the ballot. So Democracy Live would end up getting a lot of information without even you really knowing about it. It also collects the voter's name, address, date of birth, a social security number, and a browser fingerprint, which is a super hostile user tracking agent. So like you might be familiar with web cookies. Think of a version of web cookies that you can't get rid of by clearing your cookies. That's what a fingerprint basically is. It also uses Google Analytics, and Google gets your voter ID and party affiliation. And there's no privacy policy. So they can do whatever they want with this data, as far as we know. So I just want to go back to this photo, right? So we have our two idealized systems. You have the sort of in-person voting system, and then you have the beauty and purity of mathematics, and you're just trusting the beauty and purity of mathematics. But oops, you're really trusting these companies. But also you're trusting, you know, the browser that they're using and the internet connection they're using and the hosting services that the companies used, which included all of these. And then you're also entrusting the third parties that you've never heard of. And then on top of that, you're trusting the mobile phone developers like Oppo and OnePlus, who are also not necessarily US companies. So it turns out this like complicates that mathematics, that beauty and purity that we were all going for. So what were some of the challenges that we had? And I think the key challenge that we had, honestly, was vendor hostility at the time. And in fact, they took a lot of steps to make analysis hard. There was no formal documentation. And in fact, a lot of the documentation had claims like doubly anonymized, end-to-end vote encryption, anonymized voter-verified digital receipts, voter-verified audit trail, and I think my favorite was we don't cast your ballot over the internet, it's printed out first. So they would get over the internet and then print it out, and then that was yeah. It's interesting. None of these, of course, have cryptographic definitions. They kind of feel like near misses of cryptographic definitions, right? Like I know what a real guarantee is, but I'm not going to claim that I do that because I can't. There's also heavy use of program obfuscation. Votes was actually so heavily obfuscated that it crashed my version of IDA Pro. We tried to use it for the portions that use C. The vulnerability disclosure policies actually prohibited sharing results. And I think one of I don't have full time to go over every single incident that we dealt with here, but earlier that year, a student at University of Michigan apparently took a look at the system and had the FBI sicked on him, got swatted. I actually don't know what happened to this person, but they ended up getting called, cops called on them. So we were forced to deal with this situation. Like, how do we even begin to report this? And saw this quote, and it was in that same article. It said that given our elections infrastructure is classified as critical infrastructure by DHS, we will continue to report any such attempts in the future. And this actually gave us a really good idea. So we said, fine, you're critical infrastructure, cool. We'll go ahead and report to them ourselves. So we contacted CISA, and CISA helped us then anonymously report to the states. The states then were able to ameliorate the problem and back out of the use of these systems. And then we were also able to get CISA themselves, we were able to get the information to the companies. So they were super useful. We then published our papers, had to deal with the media deluge. And fast forward a few years in the future, both the companies actually still deny the results, which is really unfortunate. Votes actually went ahead and claimed that our true aim was to deliberately disrupt the elections process, to sow doubt in the security of infrastructure, and to spread fear and confusion. I promise you, I am already afraid and confused. I don't mean to spread it. It got even more extreme. So at a certain point, I actually helped, there's a bill or a law called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act makes it illegal for you to gain unauthorized access for a system. And there was a Supreme Court case that came up, which was Van Buren, v. United States, that was trying to ameliorate some of the worst parts of that bill. In particular, anti-reverse engineering clauses in terms of service. So I, along with the EFF, filed an amicus brief. This was me and actually quite a few other people, and my study was actually a part of this as an example of why you want to allow for good faith public interest security research. This was one of the case studies that they cited. And this was kind of like a very sort of wholesome thing, right? The goal was to make it clear that there's a public good reason why you do reverse engineering, which I think I'm somewhat preaching to the choir in this room, that we should be able to allow people to be able to debug civic systems, right? That security and analysis is a really good thing. Votes decided to file their own brief, then responding to the first brief for the other party, claiming that actually my research was a great example of why you shouldn't allow for independent security analysis or scrutiny. So this is just a means. So next time you're worried about someone criticizing your research, just remember at least they didn't complain to you to the Supreme Court. In this case, I'm glad to say that I can't tell whether or not they were convinced by our appeal. Actually, there was a letter that was signed by a number of security researchers actually supporting our brief. And that letter was the thing that was actually cited by the Supreme Court. And in fact, the Supreme Court did find in the direction that we were hoping for. So I count that as a win, even if they didn't cite our particular brief. So going back to deployed internet voting systems for a minute, this sort of resistance is actually incredibly common. There have been 5 public analyses of internet voting systems, as far as I'm aware, that have been published. And they're the following. And in each one of these cases, they were deployed before any public analysis was done. There were also significant barriers to analysis and disclosure. right? Things like resisting your ability to be able to say afterward what happened, NDAs, things like this. All of them, except one, had poor and misleading documentation, right? So there was no either or no documentation. And all of them were found to have severe implementation and design flaws that would allow an attacker to overturn an election. So let's talk about the bigger picture, because at this point, I'm feeling pretty existential, right? We're seeing this over and over again. There's this epic loop of sort of failure. And I come across this, my partner in research comes across this fantastic, he's in the audience, Jimmy, you should talk to, comes across this quote by the guy who funds a lot of this guy named Bradley Tusk. And he says that it's not that cybersecurity people are bad people per se, which I appreciate. I think it's that they are solving for one situation and I'm solving for another. They want zero technology risk in any way, shape, or form. And I am solving for the problem of turnout. And I get this, right? He's basically saying, right, he just wants to solve this policy problem with more technology. And this to me fails for both policy and technical reasons. The technical is pretty straightforward. We actually looked into sort of blockchain voting and applying more cryptography, and this is where I come clean a bit. I actually did not want to continue doing vulnerability discovery research when I was in grad school. My goal was to be a cryptographer, and we were studying how new cryptographic constructions could be useful in elections. And we started looking at this idea of basically backing up end-to-end verifiable systems using a blockchain. So we wrote this paper, and we came up with a bunch of schemes, but at the end of the day, we actually decided, we came up with this negative result, which just said that, no, this doesn't actually help. None of the new cryptography that we're doing is actually going to be that beneficial for the work that you're trying to get done here, for a lot of the reasons that I've expressed, that I've exemplified in the prior work. And that internet voting in general will lead to these more scalable and remote attacks. And then we see a startup that says that they have solved the problem using the blockchain, and they say, Mike, please go take a look. And that's how we get here. And this is another thing that I learned. The voting systems market is very interesting. And in particular, it's largely unregulated in a bunch of ways. It's local. There's fractured decision making. Each jurisdiction here, depending on the state, may or may not get to make independent decisions on the technology that they use. And in classic economics, information asymmetries like this actually will result in market failure, meaning the market won't value a thing if you can't measure it, you can't understand it. Which means that poor security is actually a rational choice. So this is the cycle. This is the sort of state that we're in right now. This is why we keep having this cycle of security researchers looking at a system, finding a vulnerability, it getting deployed before that ever gets out there, and the companies continuing to behave the same way. And I think that we need to sort of break that cycle. So the future to me looks something like this. This deploy, vulnerability research, press, and fix cycle is really unsustainable. Once, I'm a professor, right? I'm a computer scientist. I do research for a living. It's not to teach, despite everyone's best wishes and hopes. It's really to do research. I can't publish another paper on breaking an internet voting system. I've done it. And once you've done a thing once, it's not research anymore. It's engineering. So it's not sustainable. Current status of the world, I actually don't know anyone at CISA anymore. That organization does not have the same talent that it used to. So even reporting this probably couldn't happen today. So the research that we're doing now actually is attempting to be a lot more collaborative with the elections officials before a lot of this stuff happens. I don't want to go into that publicly right now, but if you're an elections official, my lab wants to talk to you. I've hired people who do both cryptography, system security, and more HCI-style work. And I would be incredibly excited to work with you in the future. So please reach out to me for more information. So if I had to give you just a few high-level ideas before we head out, for the general public, internet voting is really hard in theory and incredibly hard in practice. And these scalable and remote attacks are still possible. The ecosystem really isn't set up well to support research or get research into how to better examine these systems. When you invite internet voting or mobile systems into voting, you are inevitably going to include trust in many third parties that you might not expect. And unfortunately, cryptography isn't going to save you. Access, privacy, and other core parts are not solved by the end-to-end verifiability properties that we have. Even in the best of intentions, the system's concerns still dominate. I don't know how to solve those problems, and I've worked on them for quite a while. And finally, there's just many opportunities for future research. And if you are cryptographically minded or systems minded, don't despair. There are amazing other places in elections that aren't as hard as the casting and tallying part that you should absolutely try to contribute to. And if you have any questions on any of that, please reach out to me. That's my website and that's my email. So thank you.